Good morning, Ohio. It's James Ernest of the Grueling Truth Radio Network here with Albert Chen, author of Billion Dollar Fantasy, the high stakes game between FanDuel and DraftKings. So tell us what are fantasy sports?
Well, daily fantasy is a version of fantasy sports where you can win instant money on a daily basis. And really what it was this game that people weren't sure, maybe or maybe not. Was it gambling? Not sure about that. And we had two companies going head to head in terms of trying to win the market in that space. And then it just exploded into a massive marketing war.
So why did the FBI look into, just fun fantasy gaming?
Yeah, it was really an investigation into whether or not these two companies were providing something that was gambling. And so, gambling's illegal, so it would have been an illegal business if that was the case. So going forward, spin ahead into the story and, they get shut down by multiple states, and there's this whole question of the legality of the actual businesses. And there were certainly stretches where they weren't sure whether or not this company was going to exist. And here we are, 2019, and they're really well positioned for the sports gambling world going forward.
It sounds like an amazing story. What part originally got your interest?
It's really the characters behind the story. I mean, you have really two founding groups that are very unlikely. One group in Boston because, they'd never run a company before, and they were really sort of in over their heads in a lot of ways that people who start companies are in over their heads. And then you had another founding group out in the UK that had big questions about, what type of business would actually work for them, because they struggled for a very long time trying to start a business, and they kind of stumbled into this fantasy sports thing. So it was really sort of the characters of the story that were kind of unexpected and totally unlikely, but really some rich characters.
So why was an amazing story like this gone untold until now?
Well, people have covered it in varying degrees, but really it was a matter of really kind of understanding sort of the differences in, the two companies. I mean, these two companies were very different culturally. So, trying to understand the nuances of really what were actually companies that people thought were more or less the same. And actually there was this intense rivalry, and there were these two groups going head to head. And really sort of getting the stories of the actual people behind the companies was really key.
So how fast do these companies start and then grow into a billion dollar industry overnight, it feels like?
Well, they were just raising a lot of money and providing that they, were raising all this money, they were able to grow and acquire users at a very alarming clip. So, it suddenly spun out of control just because of the number of users they had, but it was really sort of this massive thing that exploded.
So tell us a little bit about that advertising war and who won it.
Well, it's still going on today, but the advertising war in the fall of 2015 was very much kind of, head-to-head sort of what do these guys sort of understand and really, in terms of the messaging, it was like, what are we, a gambling company? Are we not a gambling company? It was a very targeted marketing campaign where they were presenting themselves as gambling companies potentially, but not saying that they're gambling companies, but, you're winning money off of this product. So the marketing campaign was just on all the time. It was on every 90 seconds, and it was just absolutely insanity during football season 2015. And then it really sort of exploded into something even bigger than that.
I've heard comparisons with this book to the Barbarians at the Gate. Do you feel that's a valid comparison?
Well, it's at the end of the day a business story about a rivalry and about just like the characters behind this incredible business. So this was absolutely a unique story in some ways, but also kind of a classic business story of the underdog trying to trying to build a major business.
And like you said before about the characters, I mean, this story is just so character driven. Why did you go in that direction versus making it more of, just a clinical story, more about just the raw numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to write something where people who don't know anything about gambling and fantasy sports would kind of really latch onto it. And so that was sort of the important thing, was like really sort of getting into these characters that maybe a reader will kind of sympathize with and really sort of latch onto in terms of characters. So that, to me, was really, I wanted to write a book that, people would actually read if they weren't even into gambling or fantasy sports.
So you mentioned the one group was Boston and the other one was UK. Which one was which?
The UK group was the one behind FanDuel, and the Boston group was the one behind DraftKings. And they were very different in a lot of ways by virtue of just where they're from, but also their level of passion for these games. So one group extremely passionate, the other not so much. But they still went head-to-head, and it was just, that's why it was a really kind of a major culture contrast.
How have things changed since last year's big ruling in September that launched the ability to have sports gambling in some states?
It was really sort of this, thing where the Supreme Court struck down a decision in 2018, essentially allowed legalized gambling nationwide. So it sort of paved the way for that. And really, now we're in a situation where in certain states you can gamble on sports, in certain states you can't, and it's going to be a very slow process, but it's really a larger landscape that is really rapidly changing.
So who is currently winning the war?
It really is head-to-head right now. Off of football season last year, during NFL season, there was a surprise where FanDuel kind of took the lead. And now going into this football season, it's sort of an open question, but, it's still a very bitter rivalry and a war.
So what will the legacies of these companies be?
The legacy might be that they were at the forefront of, this larger story where everything's, being paved for a legalized, gambling across the country. And these were the two companies that were at the forefront in terms of messaging, in terms of partnering with leagues, and in terms of getting investors on board with this. So, yeah, they're a small part of what is potentially going to be a massive story.
So where is the best place to buy the book at?
You can buy it online and pretty much anywhere. It's in bookstores and, on Amazon and every online bookstore that you can imagine. So, look out for it.
Excellent. And then on social media and the web, where's the best place to catch more about the book and about yourself?
Yeah, it's Albert C. Chen on Twitter, and we've also, if you Google the book $1 Billion Fantasy, I think you'll find it.
Excellent. So I'd like to thank our guest today, Albert Chen, author of $1 Billion Fantasy, the high-stakes game between FanDuel and DraftKings. Thank you, Albert.
Thanks so much for having me.